For years, our life together had been a carefully curated portrait of success. Emily and I seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 2 wonderful kids, and a marriage that others envied. I had always taken pride in the life we built, believing that it was rooted in mutual love, trust, and understanding. But as I sat in the quiet of our living room that evening, sipping my tea and flipping through a magazine, I noticed something unusual in Emily's demeanor when she walked in. Her usual carefree grace was replaced with a brisk, almost rehearsed efficiency. She carried an envelope in her hand, her smile just a little too tight, her eyes betraying a gleam of something I couldn't quite place. "What's that?" I asked casually, gesturing toward the envelope. She set it down on the coffee table with deliberate care. "Oh, just something you'll want to read," she said, her voice light, but with an edge that made me uneasy. "What is it?" I pressed, setting my mug down. Emily crossed her arms, a smug expression playing across her face. "You've got 2 weeks to leave, David." I blinked, certain I hadn't heard her correctly. "Leave? What are you talking about?" She motioned toward the envelope. "Why don't you open it and find out?" Her tone was calm, almost cheerful, and that frightened me more than if she'd been shouting. With growing dread, I picked up the envelope, my fingers fumbling slightly as I tore it open. Inside was an eviction notice. Confusion gave way to disbelief. "Emily, what the hell is this?" I asked, my voice rising. She smirked, leaning against the arm of the couch. "It's exactly what it says. The house is sold. You've got 2 weeks to pack your things." The room spun as her words sank in. "You sold the house? Without telling me? This is our home." "Was our home," she corrected, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You've been too busy burying yourself in work to notice anything. I had to make decisions, David. Decisions for me." Her casual cruelty struck me like a physical blow. "This is a joke, right? Tell me this is a joke." Emily's smile widened, her confidence emboldened by my shock. "It's not a joke, David. I've moved on. Mark understands me in ways you never could. He's a real man, and together, we're building something better." The name, Mark, hung in the air like poison. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. "Mark? Who the hell is Mark?" Her smirk deepened. "My business partner. My lover. The man who actually listens to me instead of treating me like some background character in your life." I stared at her, my mind racing to process what she just admitted. "You sold our house for him?" "For us," she corrected. "I invested the proceeds into his business. It's a partnership, David. Something you wouldn't understand." The betrayal was staggering. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was calculated, premeditated. Emily had been planning this for months, maybe longer, all while smiling across the dinner table and pretending everything was fine. "You really think this is going to work out for you?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. Emily shrugged. "It already is. The house is gone, the papers are signed, and Mark and I are moving forward. You'll figure something out. You always do, don't you?" Her arrogance was staggering, her dismissal of everything we built together cutting deeper than I thought possible. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, and felt the first ember of resolve ignite in my chest. "You've made a huge mistake," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. Emily laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The only mistake I made was staying with you as long as I did." Her words stung, but they also strengthened my resolve. I didn't argue further. Instead, I walked upstairs, every step a struggle against the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume me. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I had missed. The realization hit me like a freight train. Emily's betrayal wasn't just about another man or money. It was about power, control, and her belief that she had outmaneuvered me. But she was wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I promised myself one thing as I drifted into a restless sleep. I would not let her win. The morning after Emily's shocking announcement felt surreal. I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, but the envelope on the coffee table was a stark reminder that my life had taken a turn I never expected. As I stood in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring at the familiar walls of our home. I couldn't reconcile the betrayal with the woman I had spent years building a life with. Emily breezed in, dressed immaculately, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Her confidence was maddening, her complete lack of remorse twisting the knife even deeper. She glanced at me, smirking as she poured herself a glass of juice. "You're up early," she said casually, as though she hadn't delivered the ultimate betrayal the night before. I set my mug down, struggling to keep my composure. "You sold the house, Emily. Our home. Without telling me. Do you even care what this does to me? To our kids?" She sighed dramatically, as if my outrage was nothing more than an inconvenience. "David, don't make this harder than it has to be. The house is just a building. You'll find another one." "A building?" I said, my voice rising. "This was supposed to be our forever home. We built our lives here, Emily. How could you throw it all away for some guy?" She rolled her eyes, sipping her juice as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "Mark isn't just some guy, David. He's a real man. He understands me, listens to me, supports me in ways you never did." Her words were like acid, eating away at the last shreds of my patience. "Supports you?" "Emily, I worked my ass off to give you and the kids everything. I was here, building a future for us while I what?" she interrupted, her tone sharp. "While I waited around for you to notice me, to care about what I needed. David, you've been so wrapped up in your work, you didn't even realize I was unhappy." The audacity of her accusation stunned me. "So your solution was to destroy our family? To sell our house and invest in some scheme with your lover?" Emily shrugged, her composure unnerving. "It's not a scheme. It's a business, one that has real potential. Unlike you, Mark doesn't think small. He has vision, ambition, something you used to have before you settled into your boring little routine." I stared at her, trying to find a trace of the woman I had married, but she was gone. In her place was someone cold, calculating, and utterly unapologetic. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked quietly. "Do you realize what you've done?" She laughed, a cruel sound that made my blood boil. "What I've done is finally take control of my life, David. You should try it sometime." The conversation was over as far as she was concerned. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door, pausing to glance over her shoulder. "Oh, and don't forget, you've got 2 weeks to leave. Mark and I have big plans for this place." With that, she was gone, leaving me alone with the echo of her betrayal. I sank into the couch, my head in my hands, replaying her words. She had justified everything. Her affair, the sale of the house, the destruction of our marriage, with a smug sense of entitlement that made my stomach churn. But as the hours passed, my shock began to give way to something else. Anger, determination, a quiet resolve that Emily would not see me broken. Over the next few days, I began piecing together the scope of her betrayal. I combed through financial records, emails, and every scrap of information I could find. What I discovered only deepened my resolve. Emily's so-called investment was a reckless gamble. Mark's business was barely afloat, held together by grandiose promises and borrowed money. She had funneled the proceeds from the sale of our home into his company, betting everything on a man who had no track record of success. I sat in my office, staring at the spreadsheets and documents spread out before me. Emily and Mark thought they had outsmarted me, but they had underestimated one crucial thing. I wasn't a man to be taken lightly. By the end of the week, I had a plan. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. If Emily and Mark wanted to play games with my life, they were about to learn that I played to win. The first step was patience. I had to let them think they had the upper hand, to let their arrogance blind them to the storm I was preparing. Emily's betrayal had been calculated, but so was my response. I stared at the eviction notice one last time before tearing it in half and tossing it into the trash. This wasn't the end of my story, far from it. It was just the beginning of a battle I had every intention of winning. The days after Emily's betrayal were a haze of anger, disbelief, and quiet preparation. I buried myself in work, compartmentalizing the chaos that had become my personal life. Every time I stepped into the house, it felt less like a home and more like a hollowed-out shell, a reminder of what Emily had destroyed. But beneath the anger, there was something else. A calm, calculating resolve. Emily and her lover thought they had won, but they didn't realize the full extent of what I knew, or the steps I was already taking to ensure their so-called victory turned to ash. Then, the phone call came. It was a Saturday evening. I had just poured myself a glass of whiskey, determined to take a moment to breathe amidst the storm. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. I hesitated before picking it up, a gut instinct telling me exactly who it would be. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. "David," the voice on the other end drawled, smug and dripping with arrogance. "It's Mark." I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone tighter. "Mark," I repeated, keeping my tone steady. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Pleasure's all mine." I figured it was time we had a little chat, man to man. "Man to man?" I said, arching an eyebrow. Interesting choice of words. Mark ignored the jab, his confidence growing with every word. "I just thought you should hear it from me. Emily's moved in with me. She's where she belongs now, with someone who knows how to treat her right." I said nothing, letting him talk. "She told me all about you," he continued, his tone condescending. "How you were too busy with your boring little life to notice her unhappiness. How you let her slip through your fingers. Honestly, you should be thanking me. I've saved you the trouble of keeping up appearances." My grip on the phone tightened, but I kept my voice calm. "How generous of you." Mark laughed, clearly enjoying himself. "Generous is one way to put it. But let's be clear, David. Emily is mine now. She chose me because I'm everything you're not. I own her in every way that matters." The words cut deep, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Anything else?" I asked, my tone even. "Oh, I'm just getting started," he said. "You thought you were untouchable, didn't you? That your perfect little world was safe. Well, guess what? I'm building something with Emily that'll leave you in the dust. You're just a relic of her past now." I let him gloat, every word adding fuel to the fire burning inside me. Finally, he paused, as if expecting a response. "Are you done?" I asked. "For now," he said, his arrogance radiating through the phone. "But don't worry, you'll be hearing plenty about us in the future. Mark and Emily, the power couple. Get used to it." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a cold, deliberate tone. "Mark, before you get too comfortable with your little fantasy, you might want to double-check the deed." The line went silent for a moment, his confidence faltering. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You'll figure it out," I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Have a good night." I ended the call, setting the phone down on the table as a sense of satisfaction washed over me. Let Mark bask in his delusions for a little while longer. He had no idea what was coming. It didn't take long for my phone to buzz again. I knew it would. Mark's confidence had been paper thin, and the crack I'd left in it was already spreading. When I saw his name flash on the screen, I let it ring for a moment before answering, savoring the anticipation. "What the hell did you do?" Mark's voice was frantic, a far cry from the smug tone he had used earlier. "Good evening, Mark," I said evenly, leaning back in my chair. "I see you've been doing some reading. What did you mean by check the deed?" "What is this?" he demanded, his words tumbling over each other in barely contained panic. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the shift in power. Finally, I replied, "It's exactly what it sounds like. While Emily sold the house, she didn't do her homework on what came next. The business she invested in? Let's just say the majority stake doesn't belong to you, or her." "You're lying," he snapped, though his voice wavered. "There's no way you're involved. Emily would have told me." I chuckled, low and deliberate. "Oh, I'm involved. I've been involved for years. Quietly, of course. You see, Mark, when you went around pitching your visionary business idea to investors, I was one of the first to see it. Back then, it had promise, enough for me to buy in. But I kept my name off the books because I don't like being in the spotlight. It's messy." Mark was silent for a beat, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "This can't be true," he said, though his conviction was crumbling. Oh, it's true, I replied, my voice calm but firm. I own 51% of your company. That means I have controlling interest. And now that I know exactly what you've been doing with the funds, using them to play house with my wife, no less, I think it's time we reevaluate some things. You can't do this, he spat, his panic spilling over into anger. You have no right. I have every right, I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut through his bluster. You see, Mark, while you and Emily were busy celebrating your so-called victory, I was making sure your house of cards had a strong gust of wind aimed at it. Did you really think you could outmaneuver me? Take my house, my wife, and my dignity without consequences? You're in over your head, and the sooner you accept that, the better. Mark's breathing grew heavier, his composure unraveling by the second. What do you want? He finally asked, his tone desperate. Want? I echoed. I don't want anything from you, Mark. This isn't about negotiating or finding common ground. This is about accountability. Emily's choices, your arrogance, it's all catching up to you. And now, you get to watch as everything you've built crumbles under its own weight. You can't just pull out of the company, he shouted. I need those funds. And that's precisely why I can, I said. Because you need me more than I'll ever need you. The line went silent, his rage and panic filling the void. For a man who thought he'd won, Mark was now realizing he'd been playing a losing game from the start. You won't get away with this, he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. I smiled, leaning forward as if he could see the confidence on my face. Mark, I already have. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have more important things to attend to. Good luck explaining this to Emily. I ended the call, setting my phone down with a sense of finality. It wasn't about revenge, at least, not entirely. This was about taking back control, about reminding both of them that I wasn't the fool they had made me out to be. I imagined the scene on their end, Mark pacing, his face pale as he tried to explain to Emily what had just happened. The cracks in their supposed perfect partnership were already showing, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. I poured myself another drink, savoring the quiet satisfaction of watching their arrogance unravel. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the scales were beginning to tip back in my favor. And this was just the beginning. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Mark's business, already on shaky ground, began to buckle under the weight of my actions. Without the financial safety net I had provided as a silent investor, his company was exposed for what it truly was, a bloated, overhyped dream that had been held together by borrowed time and borrowed money. The first cracks appeared just days after I cut my funding. I received a call from one of the company's suppliers, a man I had dealt with when I initially invested. David, he said, his tone cautious, I've been hearing rumors about Mark's business. Are you still involved? Not anymore, I replied, leaning back in my chair. Why do you ask? Well, payments have been delayed, again. And now there's talk of contracts being canceled. I thought you might know something. I smiled, though there was no joy in it. I'd suggest renegotiating those contracts. Mark won't be able to keep up much longer. The supplier side. Figured as much. Thanks for the heads up. By the end of the week, the dominoes began to fall. Mark's clients started pulling out, one by one, unwilling to risk their money on a sinking ship. His employees, once loyal to his vision, began jumping ship as well, their faith in him shattered. And then came the mutual friends. My phone buzzed constantly, old acquaintances reaching out to share the latest gossip. David, you won't believe this, Clara, one of Emily's former friends, said during one call. Mark's business is in free fall. Emily's been trying to spin it as a temporary setback, but everyone knows it's over. And get this, she's blaming you. Of course she is, I said, unable to suppress a chuckle. She always did have a talent for deflecting responsibility. It's all anyone's talking about, Clara continued. They were so smug, acting like they had everything figured out. Now it's a complete disaster. Honestly, it's kind of satisfying to watch. I thanked her for the update, though I didn't need her confirmation. I could see the cracks from a mile away. Emily wasn't handling the pressure well. Word spread that her relationship with Mark had grown tense, Their once united front now splintered by the reality of their circumstances. She's furious with him, another mutual friend told me during a chance encounter. She keeps saying he promised her the world, and now she's stuck in this mess. Mark's not much better. He's telling everyone Emily's demands are what drove him to overextend in the first place. It was poetic, really. The two of them, so eager to tear me down, now tearing each other apart in the wake of their own greed and arrogance. But I wasn't content to sit back and watch. With the help of my lawyer, Andrew, I made moves to ensure they couldn't recover. We froze assets tied to my investment, filed legal actions to reclaim my share of the house proceeds, and secured court orders to block any attempts by Mark or Emily to access what remained of my financial ties to them. The final blow came when Mark's creditors began circling. With no cash flow and no way to stabilize the business, he was forced to file for bankruptcy. Emily, who had banked everything on his success, found herself not only without a home but also without the financial security she had taken for granted. The house she and Mark had dreamed of building together was gone, the proceeds swallowed by debts and lawsuits. Their perfect partnership had turned into a public spectacle of blame and desperation. One evening, Andrew called me with an update. "It's official," he said. "Mark's business is bankrupt, and the assets are being liquidated. Emily's stake is worthless." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Good. Let them deal with the consequences. Andrew hesitated. "There's one more thing. Emily's been trying to reach out to you. Apparently, she's not doing well." "She made her bed," I said coldly. "She can lie in it." By the end of the month, Emily and Mark had become the talk of the town, for all the wrong reasons. Their smug confidence, their grand plans, their arrogance. It had all come crashing down, leaving them with nothing but the wreckage of their choices. As for me, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Their downfall wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the architects of their own ruin. I stood in the empty halls of my reclaimed home, the silence a reminder of what I had endured. It wasn't the same house anymore, but it was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Walking into the house felt surreal. The place that had once been my sanctuary now bore the scars of betrayal. Empty walls, bare floors, and an eerie silence replaced the warmth and laughter that had once defined it. But this was my home again, stripped of the toxicity that Emily and Mark had brought into my life. The court had officially ruled in my favor. The house, the equity, and everything tied to it were now mine again. Mark and Emily had no leverage left. They had burned every bridge, and all they had to show for their schemes was the wreckage of their lives. I began the process of reclaiming my space, not just physically but emotionally. The first step was clearing out the remnants of Emily's presence. Her expensive decor, chosen more to impress guests than to create a home, was boxed up and sent to her brother's house. I replaced it with things that felt more like me, simple, functional, and meaningful. During one of my first nights back in the house, I walked through each room, letting memories wash over me. The kids' bedrooms were still filled with their toys and posters, a stark reminder of the life we had shared before everything fell apart. I promised myself I'd rebuild this space for them, creating a haven where they could feel safe and loved. The next step was securing my financial interests. My lawyer, Andrew, had been a godsend throughout this process. He worked tirelessly to ensure that every legal avenue was explored, every loophole closed. "David," Andrew said during one of our meetings, "I've finalized the asset freeze. Mark and Emily can't touch anything tied to your investments or the house. You're in the clear." "Good," I replied, nodding. "And the proceeds from the sale of the house? They've been reclaimed under the court's ruling. It's all back where it belongs, with you." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For months, I had lived under the shadow of their betrayal, but now, the tables had turned. Emily and Mark, on the other hand, were in freefall. Mutual friends continued to feed me tidbits of their unraveling. Mark was reportedly living out of a cramped apartment, drowning in debt and legal battles. Emily, once the picture of high society, had become a pariah. She's trying to spin it like she's the victim, Clara told me during a phone call, saying Mark manipulated her into selling the house and making bad investments. But no one's buying it. Let her try, I said, a hint of satisfaction in my voice. It doesn't change the facts. The few times Emily tried to contact me, I ignored her calls. She left voicemails, her tone shifting from defiant to desperate. "David, we need to talk," she said in one message. "I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. Please call me back." I didn't respond. Emily had made her choices, and she would have to live with them. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding. Renovations began on the house, transforming it into something new. I painted the walls in warm, inviting colors, replaced the cold, modern furniture with pieces that felt comfortable and lived in, and turned the backyard into a space where the kids could play and we could make new memories. Friends and family rallied around me during this time, offering support and encouragement. My parents took the kids for a weekend so I could focus on the renovations, and my brother even flew in to help with some of the heavy lifting. "This place is going to look amazing," he said as we worked on installing new light fixtures in the living room. "It already feels better," I admitted, glancing around the room, "like I can breathe again." By the time the renovations were complete, the house felt like a completely different place. It was no longer a reminder of what I had lost, but a testament to what I had overcome. One evening, as I stood in the newly finished kitchen, I received a call from Andrew. "David, I just wanted to let you know the final paperwork has been filed. Everything is officially yours now, no strings attached." I let out a long breath, a sense of closure washing over me. "Thank you, Andrew, for everything. You earned this," he said. "Enjoy it." After hanging up, I stepped outside onto the porch, the cool evening air wrapping around me. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. Emily and Mark's betrayal had been a storm, but I had weathered it. And now, standing in the home I had reclaimed, I knew that I was stronger for it. As the sun set over the horizon, I raised a glass to the future, not to revenge, but to resilience. The house was finally mine again. Every corner, every wall, every room carried a new sense of ownership, not tainted by the shadows of betrayal, but illuminated by the strength it had taken to reclaim it. Standing in the newly renovated living room, I felt like I had crossed a finish line. The storm that Emily and Mark had unleashed on my life had passed, and I was standing firmly in its wake, ready to rebuild. The kids returned home from their extended stay with my parents, their laughter filling the space once more. They were unaware of the specifics of what had transpired between their mother and me. I had decided to protect them from the messiness of the truth, opting instead to tell them in simple terms that their mom and I had decided to go our separate ways. One Saturday afternoon, as I was grilling in the backyard, Ethan wandered over to me, a curious expression on his face. "Dad," he asked, "are we ever going to live with Mom again?" I paused, the question catching me off guard. "Why do you ask, buddy?" He shrugged, poking at the ground with a stick. "I don't know. It just feels different now, like she's not part of our family anymore." Kneeling down to his level, I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your mom will always be a part of our family, Ethan. Even if we're not living in the same house, she loves you and your sister very much." "But what about you?" he pressed. I smiled softly. "I'll always be here for you, no matter what. That's a promise." He seemed satisfied with that answer and ran off to join Lily, who was setting up a game of tag with a few neighborhood kids. Watching them play, I felt a pang of bittersweet relief. They were adapting, finding joy in the new normal, and that gave me hope for the future. The house became a hub of activity in the weeks that followed. Friends and family visited often, offering their support and helping me fill the space with new memories. One of the most surprising sources of encouragement came from Sarah, a woman I had met in my hiking group. Sarah was kind and unassuming, with a quiet strength that drew me in. She had been through her own share of challenges, and our conversations often veered into topics of resilience and starting over. One evening, after a particularly long hike, we sat on a rock overlooking the valley, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. "You've been through a lot," she said, glancing at me. "And yet, here you are, still standing." "Barely," I admitted with a small laugh. "But yeah, I guess I am." She smiled, her gaze steady. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. A lot of people would have crumbled under what you've been through, but you didn't. Her words stayed with me long after that hike. Over time, our friendship deepened into something more, though we both moved cautiously, respecting the scars we carried from our pasts. Meanwhile, Emily's life continued to unravel. Mutual friends occasionally filled me in on her struggles, how Mark had all but disappeared after his bankruptcy, leaving her to fend for herself. She had moved in with her brother, working odd jobs to make ends meet. The glamorous socialite who once looked down on me for my boring stability was now scraping by, her confidence replaced by a humbling desperation. One day, I received an email from her. It was short, almost curt. David, can we talk? I know I don't deserve it, but I need to apologize. Please let me explain. Emily. I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her wallow in the mess she had created. But another part, the part that still valued closure, knew I needed to hear her out. We met at a small cafe downtown. She looked different, thinner, and more subdued, her once pristine appearance now marked by exhaustion. David, she began, her voice trembling. Thank you for meeting me. I nodded, remaining silent as she fidgeted with her coffee cup. I've had a lot of time to think, she said finally, about what I did. To you, to our family. I was selfish and blind, and I let my own insecurities ruin everything. Her words were genuine, but they didn't move me. I had spent too much time cleaning up the mess she'd left behind to feel anything but indifference. I don't expect forgiveness, she continued, her voice breaking, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. I met her gaze, my voice steady. Emily, I appreciate the apology, but forgiveness isn't about you. It's about me. And I forgave you a long time ago, not because you asked for it, but because I needed to move on. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. I wish I could undo it all. You can't, I said simply, but you can learn from it. That's all any of us can do. We parted ways after that, the conversation leaving me with a sense of finality I hadn't realized I needed. Emily's chapter in my life was officially closed. That evening, I stood on the porch of my newly reclaimed home, watching the sunset with Sarah beside me. The kids played in the yard, their laughter filling the air. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole again. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had built from the ashes. And it was mine. It was a quiet morning when I received the unexpected call from Emily. I was sitting in the backyard with a cup of coffee, the early sunlight filtering through the trees, watching Lily and Ethan chase each other across the lawn. The phone buzzed on the table beside me, and when I saw her name on the screen, I hesitated before answering. David, her voice came through, hesitant and trembling. I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Her tone was different this time. Gone was the smug confidence that had once defined her. This wasn't the Emily who had laughed in my face as she handed me an eviction notice. This was someone humbled, broken, and searching for something she had lost. What is it, Emily? I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a long pause before she spoke again. Can we meet? Please. I need to see you. I could have said no. Every part of me wanted to remind her of the pain she'd caused, the mess I had been left to clean up, but something in her voice stopped me. All right, I said finally. Tomorrow, at the cafe by the park. Noon. The next day, I arrived early, sitting at a corner table where I could see the entrance. Emily walked in a few minutes later, and I almost didn't recognize her. She looked smaller, her once polished and poised demeanor replaced by a subdued air. Her clothes were simple, her hair pulled back in a way that seemed more practical than stylish. David, she said as she approached, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, she spoke. I don't know where to start, she admitted, her hands clutching the edge of the table. I've replayed everything in my head 1,000 times, trying to figure out how I let things get so out of control. Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her lap. Mark is gone. The business is gone. Everything I thought I was building, everything I thought I wanted, fell apart, and I have no one to blame but myself. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. Why are you telling me this, Emily? She looked up, her eyes glassy with tears. Because I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For the way I treated you. For the lies, the betrayal, all of it. I thought I was chasing something better, but all I did was destroy the best thing I ever had. Her words were raw, unpolished, and they carried a weight I hadn't expected. But I wasn't sure if it was enough to move me. I don't know what you want me to say, I replied, my tone measured. What you did wasn't just a mistake, Emily. It was a choice. A series of choices, over and over again, to put yourself above everyone else. Above me, above the kids, above everything we built together. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to tell you, to own up to it, because for so long, I blamed you for everything. But the truth is, it was me. It was always me. I watched her for a long moment, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to tell her exactly how much pain she'd caused, to unload all the anger and frustration I had buried. But another part of me realized I didn't need to. I forgave you a long time ago, I said finally, my voice calm. Not because you asked for it, but because I needed to move on. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. She looked at me, her expression a mix of relief and regret. Thank you, she whispered. I nodded, standing up. Take care of yourself, Emily. As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. Emily's apology didn't erase what she had done, but it allowed me to finally close the door on that chapter of my life. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I reflected on how far I had come. Emily's regret was her burden to carry, not mine. My life was no longer tied to her choices or her mistakes. Lily and Ethan joined me on the porch, their laughter filling the air as they talked about their day. Sarah arrived shortly after, her smile lighting up the evening as she joined us. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace. Emily's regret was a reminder of the lessons I had learned, but my life was no longer defined by her betrayal. It was defined by the resilience I had found in its aftermath. The days following my meeting with Emily were surprisingly light. Her apology, while overdue and unable to undo the past, had given me a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. The chapter of Emily and Mark was finally closed, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. Life had taken on a steady rhythm, one that felt comforting and new. The house, once a symbol of loss, was now a sanctuary of renewal. I had transformed the space into something entirely my own. Every color, every piece of furniture, every detail reflecting the person I had become. The kids adjusted quickly to the new normal, their laughter filling the house in a way that made the effort worthwhile. I dedicated my weekends to them, taking them to the park, cooking meals together, and helping them with school projects. Dad, can we paint the treehouse? Lily asked one Saturday morning, her eyes bright with excitement. Paint it? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, it's boring brown. Let's make it fun, Ethan chimed in. I smiled, ruffling their hair. All right, but you two are doing the hard work. I'm just supervising. As we spent the day painting the treehouse in bright blues and greens, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Despite everything that had happened, I still had this, my children, my home, and a life worth rebuilding. Meanwhile, my work life began to flourish in unexpected ways. Photography, which had once been a hobby, evolved into a full-fledged business. I started booking clients for family portraits, weddings, and even corporate events. The creative outlet gave me a sense of purpose and fulfillment I hadn't felt in years. Sarah was one of my biggest supporters. She had an uncanny ability to encourage me without pushing, to listen without judgment, and to be there when I needed her most. One evening, as we sat on the porch sipping wine, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. You've come a long way, you know, she said, her voice soft. Have I? I asked, smiling slightly. She nodded. When we first met, you seemed weighed down, like you were carrying the world on your shoulders. But now, I see someone who's found his footing again. It's inspiring. Her words meant more than I could express. Sarah had been a steady presence throughout my healing, her kindness and patience helping me rediscover parts of myself I thought I had lost. Over time, our friendship deepened into something more. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was organic, built on trust and mutual respect. She didn't expect me to be anything other than who I was, and that was a refreshing change from what I had known before. One afternoon, as we hiked through a wooded trail, she stopped suddenly, looking up at the canopy of trees above us. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, turning to me. "All the time," I admitted. And I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs. "I think I'm finally ready to move forward. Not just survive, but live." She smiled, slipping her hand into mine. "Good. You deserve that." Our relationship was still in its early stages, but it felt right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't second-guessing myself or questioning my worth. I was simply allowing myself to be happy. As for Emily, her life continued to be a cautionary tale among our former social circles. The woman who had once seemed untouchable was now a shadow of her former self. She had started working at a boutique downtown, her days spent folding clothes and answering to a manager half her age. "Have you heard from her?" Sarah asked one evening as we sat by the fire pit in the backyard. "Not since our meeting," I said. "She's reached out to the kids a few times, which is good. But as far as I'm concerned, that part of my life is over." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "I think that's healthy. You've done your part, David. The rest is up to her." And she was right. I had spent too much time looking back, trying to make sense of what had happened. But now, my focus was forward, on my children, my passions, and the life I was building with Sarah. One evening, as the kids played in the yard and Sarah laughed beside me, I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant learning from it, growing because of it, and using it as a foundation for something better. The scars Emily had left were still there, but they no longer defined me. They were reminders of resilience, of strength, and of the journey that had led me here, to a life that was fuller, richer, and more meaningful than I could have imagined. Months had passed since the storm of Emily's betrayal had subsided, and my life had taken on a peaceful rhythm. The house, once a battleground for lies and betrayal, was now a place of warmth, laughter, and renewal. Every corner bore the mark of a fresh start, a sanctuary built on resilience and hope. One evening, as I stood on the porch watching the kids play in the yard, a sense of profound gratitude washed over me. The life I was living now felt earned, like a hard-fought victory. I had weathered the storm, and in its place was a calm that I hadn't realized I needed. Sarah joined me, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me with a smile, her presence as grounding as ever. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. "Everything," I admitted, taking a sip of the warm tea. "How far I've come. How far we've come." She leaned against the porch railing, her gaze following mine to where Lily and Ethan were chasing fireflies in the twilight. "You should be proud of yourself, David. Not everyone could have come through what you did and still find a way to build something so beautiful." Her words struck a chord. For so long, I had focused on what I had lost. My trust in Emily, the life we had built together, and the stability I thought would last forever. But now, I could see how those losses had made room for something better. The next day, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was from Emily. I opened it reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note, her words carefully chosen and surprisingly heartfelt. "David, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I felt like I needed to write this. Not to ask for anything, but to finally say what I couldn't before. I've spent so much time reflecting on everything I did, how I hurt you, how I betrayed the life we built together. It's taken losing everything to realize what I had. You didn't deserve any of it, and I will carry the weight of that guilt for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope you know that I'm truly sorry. For the lies, for the betrayal, for breaking apart the family we had. I can only hope that you've found peace and happiness, because you deserve that and so much more. Thank you for being the man I was too blind to appreciate. Emily. I sat with the letter for a long time, reading and rereading her words. There was a time when I would have wanted this apology desperately, but now, it felt like it was more for her than for me. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, not out of anger, but because I didn't need it. Emily's regret was her burden, not mine. I had moved beyond that chapter, and her words, while meaningful, didn't change the path I was now walking. Later that evening, as the kids settled in for bed, I found myself on the porch again. The cool breeze carried the sounds of the night, a soothing reminder of how life moves on, regardless of what we endure. Sarah joined me, her hand slipping into mine as she sat beside me. "You're quiet tonight," she said. "I got a letter from Emily," I admitted. She didn't press, simply nodding as she waited for me to continue. She apologized, took responsibility for everything. It was unexpected. "How do you feel about it?" she asked gently. I thought for a moment before answering. Relieved, I think. Not because I needed her apology, but because it feels like the final piece of closure. Like the last thread tying me to that part of my life has been cut. Sarah smiled, her gaze warm. "Then that's a good thing." "It is," I agreed, squeezing her hand. As the stars began to dot the night sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road that had brought me here had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided by betrayal. I was someone stronger, more self-assured, and ready to embrace the life ahead of me. Standing on the porch of the home I had reclaimed, watching the life I had rebuilt unfold around me, I raised my glass to the stars, not to revenge, not to regret, but to resilience. This was the final chapter of one story and the beginning of another.